This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there and welcome to Global Business Africa. We'll be giving you insight into Africa's business and financial markets. I'm Uche Okoronkwo, coming to you from Kenya's capital, Nairobi. Let's start with a look at the markets. Now, emerging markets continue to react to US-China trade tensions. We saw MSCI's Developing World Stock Index slipping about 0.2% on the day, especially hurt by index heavyweight China, falling about 1.6% today. However, South Africa's JSE, it did close in the green, higher in a mild relief rally we saw today, and that's after falling over 2% yesterday. Now, also coming up on the show, Abidjan hosts the 2019 Summit on Trade between the USA and Sub-Saharan Africa. The government in South Africa under fire for its handling of the Eskom debt burden. And the struggle to make a living amongst those displaced by militant group Boko Haram in Nigeria. Now, the African Growth and Opportunity Act Forum has closed in the Ivorian capital of Abidjan. It was co-hosted by the United States and Cote d'Ivoire and brought together senior government officials from the United States and 39 sub-Saharan African nations. They discuss ways to boost economic cooperation and trade. Stakeholders from the private sector, civil society, and regional economic communities also participated. Now, discussions there focused on laying the groundwork for an even closer trade and investment partnership, especially on the back of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area.
Significant hurdles are still to be overcome to enable African countries to fully benefit from access to the vast American market of 350 million consumers.
We will combine the promise of the AFCFTA with these new U.S. initiatives to help maximize the potential of U.S.-Africa trade.
Well, let's break down this year's meeting. We're joined by Professor Patrick Bond. He is a political economic analyst from the School of Governance at Wits University. Very welcome to the show, Professor. Now, of course, as we mentioned, this year's forum focused on laying the groundwork for a closer trade and investment partnership between the U.S. and Africa. Some still say that AGOA is underutilized and it will be very difficult to renew it in 2025. Do you think that deal requires some tweaking going forward? And what did you hope to see coming out of this year's forum?
Oh, it's definitely not working. The peak trade between the US and Africa exceeded $100 billion about a decade ago at the peak, and now it's down to around 40 billion. So it's about a 60% decline. And that reflects the commodity prices have been much lower and that the US has moved away from importing as much oil from Nigeria and Angola as it used to. But the main thing is it didn't do as promised, help to develop the African continent with a better balance, better industry, and indeed in the main industrial area where South Africa exports, that is aluminium and steel, as well as automobiles, we've had very serious threats that the protected trade relationships with the US would just be ended as Donald Trump engages in his notorious protectionism. So yeah, tweaks are needed. In fact, I think a whole question should be raised. Is the United States a trade partner you can trust and do business with, given that President Trump has called the continent by derogatory names, S-hole, and his main security advisor, John Bolton, predicted that Africa would be the site of the Cold War with China. So this is a place where AFRICOM, the US African Command, is running rampant in about 39 countries, and I think some very serious questions must be asked with Donald Trump in the presidency.
Right, and you're quite right, because at the forum this year, they already seem to have different views on the future trade relationship. The US seems to be favoring bilateral trade agreements, and of course the AU wants more free trade agreements going forward. How does this all color your outlook for the US engagement with Africa going forward?
Well, you're right that the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, Tibor Nagy, did indeed say he didn't want to find an Africa free trade area by 2030 in a free trade relationship with the U.S. As you say, he wants bilateral, and it's a simple reason. It's more power of the U.S. against 54 separate countries than if it were one bloc negotiating. Just as one simple reflection of that, Rwanda was more or less tossed out of AGOA, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, last year because it wanted to limit the second-hand clothing that was coming in as it tried to develop its own clothing industry. And the US government just said, no, none of that. If you try to limit our second-hand exports from the US to Rwanda, then you're not going to get any of the other benefits of exporting from Rwanda to the US. It's that kind of pressure. It's a pressure that's ideological because it relates to the conditions that every African country needs to toe the line and become a neoliberal exporter. And that's why Tibor Nagy said he wanted deals with each of the countries on a bilateral basis rather than if the US had to actually negotiate with one bloc with 1 billion consumers with a united Africa in the African Union. Of course, that's what we all hope will happen if indeed the free trade agreement does hold once in about a year it comes into effect.
Right. Now, one thing the AU said is that it wanted to renegotiate the AGOA deal with one voice after the deal expires in 2025. And of course, taking into account the recent launch of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement in May of this year, what do you think this all means for the U.S. Engagement with Africa going forward, given that we may be approaching them as a continent?
Yes, well, look, it's about 1.5 years of uncertainty if Donald Trump leaves the presidency in an election that he loses and he agrees to leave. Now, that's a big if. Then, who replaces him? Would it be somebody that has a more amenable view of Africa? And there are 3 candidates, one an African American, a senator, Kamala Harris. The other 2, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, have become known as the left in the United States. They'd have a more open view. And the leading candidate to replace Trump is Joe Biden, the former vice president under Obama, who is pretty hard line in promoting U.S. corporate interests. So it all is up in the air. You know, you can't really look to 2025 until we see what happens in November 2020. But yes, that's the question. Should Africa rapidly get the free trade agreement? Can it balance out the 3 strong economies where there are very powerful companies, South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya? Will there be imbalance as, say, here in Johannesburg, our companies move up continent and take advantage of the free trade area? In a way, they've been accused of unethical behavior. MTN, the big cell phone company, for example, repeatedly fined by the Nigerians for illicit financial flows and other crimes. This is a big question as to whether we'll have a really solid free trade area or whether some of the larger regional sub-hegemons like South Africa will abuse it.
Well, a number of pertinent questions you're asking there. We have to leave it there. But thanks so much for joining us. That was Professor Patrick Bond. He is a political and economic analyst from Wits University. Well, let's move on now. Speaking about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, the recently signed agreement is intended to increase trading amongst African nations as well as eliminate tariffs. But that's not the view in Nigeria. Now, experts in the country say the agreement is inconsistent with the nation's protectionist policies and may hinder the process of implementing the deal. Well, CGTN's Daniel Arap Moy explains.
Africa is currently forging ahead with its free trade area project. However, the pact, believed to create a $3.4 trillion economic bloc, is causing a stir in the continent's largest economy. Just like many in Nigeria, Adeleke Adeleye views the African Free Trade Agreement as a threat.
It's definitely not a level playing field. And it's to me, I consider Nigeria the lion of Africa. You know, we have the largest population, we have the largest market. So it feels like
agreement, only signing on last month. Now that it's in, some trade experts fear its long history of economic protectionism will undermine the bloc. At the same time, small manufacturers are worried Nigeria could be flooded with cheap goods from more competitive neighbors.
There is smuggling, but at least they are still trying to reduce the pressure. The thing is coming down now. Really, people are still trying to. Some people are saying to survive all those stuff, but the custom here at this command, they are trying their best.
Harmonization of the custom arrangements, particularly not just the custom tariffs, but also non-tariff barriers and technical barriers. I think these are something that have to be negotiated among the participants in the agreement that will try to eliminate the possibility of increased dumping and increased smuggling.
Africa's manufacturing industry accounts for only about 10% of the African Union's combined GDP of $3.4 trillion. In Nigeria, manufacturers face diverse production challenges that put them at a disadvantage when compared to their counterparts on the deal.
We were not, but we've signed. So we just have to be ready. We've signed, so there's no going back. We just have to be ready.
But many here, like Adeleye, are waiting and watching to see the African Free Trade Agreement turn around their businesses and the economy. Daniel Arab Moy, CGTN.
Well, let's go to Egypt now. The country's finance minister says the country has received the final $2 billion tranche of its IMF loan. Now, according to Mohamed Mait, the latest chunk has been added to the state's central bank, which will increase Egypt's foreign exchange cash reserve to about $46 billion compared to the current $44.3 billion. Now, the North African nation started its IMF-supported $12 billion austerity-based economic program in November 2016. Over the three-year period, it has been carrying out economic reforms, including a steep devaluation of its pound, as well as deep cuts to its energy subsidies and the introduction of new taxes in order to lure back investors. And to South Africa now, the country's biggest business lobby has criticized the government's handling of power utility Eskom's debt burden. In a letter sent to its members, Business Unity South Africa expressed its frustration with the delays in seeking a new CEO for the cash-strapped utility, which is currently drowning in more than $30 billion of debt. It also warned that the government will need to seek a bailout from the IMF unless it confronts these problems. Now, over the years, South Africa has had to pledge billions of dollars to keep Eskom afloat. However, it has made no progress yet as it continues to grapple with a struggling economy as well as an unemployment rate that is at its highest in almost a decade. Well, let's delve further into this with CGTN correspondent Angelo Coppola. He joins us now in Johannesburg. Welcome to the show, Angelo. Great to have you. Now, those were quite harsh words from basically the country's biggest business lobby, BUSA. They have largely remained silent till now. So this also comes after a meeting which they had with Ramaphosa and some of his members of parliament last week. So give us a sense of what this public criticism could mean for Ramaphosa and certainly his economic revival plan.
Well, look, the $100 billion investment plan appears to still be intact. He's been rather focused on that drive since he announced it last year. There's still some traction there, obviously, and it appears that we've cleared all the decks in terms of what was existing investments that were coming in and the new investments that have been as a result of Ramaphosa's drive to raise that $100 billion. But he's been rather quiet on the plan to resurrect the economy. That's the National Development Plan, the NPA, or the NDP, should I say. That was pulled out of the files, it was dusted off, and it was presented by Ramaphosa at SONA in May. I'm told that he does need to be speaking to many constituencies at the moment to reassure them that he's still in charge and he's still in control and driving this economic growth plan that he's, and also more importantly that he's also managing his cabinet. So there's lots of talking that Ramaphosa has to be doing, and he's been rather quiet about it, Uche.
Well, Angelo, interesting that we also saw the CEO of Nedbank, which of course is the country's fourth biggest bank by assets. This week he did warn that significantly more urgency is needed from the government, and he said this publicly. Is this a clear sign, given the message we got from BUSA as well, that the business community in South Africa has lost faith in Ramaphosa?
Well, it certainly appears like that's what's happening at the moment. Of course, the pro-government lobby groups have been rather quiet. They were waiting for Ramaphosa to make a bit more public announcements and pronouncements about the plans and what was being done. Of course, Busa didn't wait, and although it was in a letter to its members, it did make those comments. There was, however, some activity today. Ramaphosa had a meeting with what is known as his National Planning Commission. They've been in place since 2015, and that was just before he flew off to Mozambique to go and witness the signing of that very historical peace deal in the country. But earlier this evening, the presidency also released its short-term meeting schedule for the next couple of weeks, and it interestingly includes meetings with prominent economists next week. There are also 2 public sector meetings where it appears that the government or the presidency wants to align the government departments in terms of what the economic plans are. So what we have right now are more meetings, but not much in the way of deadline-driven plans, Uche.
That certainly sounds hopeful, Angelo, but we did see demand at South Africa's weekly bond auction fall today, which of course is significant because it is partly to fund that rescue fund for Eskom. So how much progress, Angelo, has the government made with regards to restructuring this state-owned enterprises such as Eskom, as well as raising the funding that is greatly needed and managing the country's growing debt burden? How critical is South Africa's fiscal position right now?
Well, look, progress has been slow. In some instances, people are likening it to watching cement dry. Last week's Eskom results showed that the SOE is still muddling along. There's still no clear plan to speak of, and it still has that massive debt burden from local municipalities, as well as that debt burden it's got to service in terms of the international finance institutions. Economists and business analysts agree that any plan to pull South Africa out of this spiral has to include sustainable solutions for Eskom, and to a much lesser extent SAA and those other SOEs that are floundering at the moment. This evening, Moody's agreed with that comment from the business community and from the economists. It said a turnaround plan was urgently needed. So it's touch and go at the moment. Nedbank also today revised its economic growth forecast down to 0.5% for the year and was sitting at 1.3%. Of course, Moody's are sitting and watching from the wings, waiting to see what government's going to do with Eskom and how it's going to get that business sorted out before they pronounce. They are meant to pronounce in November, but it's likely that they could even pronounce a little bit earlier. And yet there is a silver lining here. Foreign direct investment is moving in the right direction, I'm told. After dipping to around 0.5% of GDP in 2013, it reached 2.2% of GDP last year. And that's more than double the GDP growth rate for 2018. And some are suggesting this might even be a green shoot, Uche.
Well, that certainly sounds positive, Angelo. We'll leave it on that note. Thank you so much for joining us. Of course, that was Angelo Coppola joining us in Johannesburg. Well, let's take a look at some of our corporate headlines for the day. Nedbank has called on the government of South Africa to fix the struggling economy after its first half earnings flatlined. The company's corporate and retail clients defaulted on their debts due to a tough economic environment as employment rose to an 11-year high. Of course, South Africa has had its worst quarterly contraction in a decade. And Nigeria's Access Bank and Union Bank have each issued a $98.1 million bond. The issuance of the bond utilizes the falling yields on the local currency debt market. Now, Access Bank sold a 7-year bond at a 15.5% yield, while mid-tier rival Union priced its 10-year bond to yield 16.2%. And Uganda's Stanbic has posted a 37.5% jump in untaxed profit to $50 million for the first half of 2019. This has been driven by a surge in credit growth due to the country's economic expansion by 6.1%. The central bank held its benchmark rate at 10% at its last meeting and projected a faster expansion. An Australian oil and gas explorer, FAR, has announced that a unit of China National Offshore Oil will take a majority stake in its projects off the coast of West Africa's Guinea-Bissau. Now, CNOOC is expected to get a 55.6% stake in the Sinapa and Esperanza licenses from Sweden's Svenska Petroleum Exploration, whose interest will be reduced to 23.03%. And that's a look at our corporate headlines. let's take a quick break now. Here's a look at what's still to come. British drug maker GlaxoSmithKline to drop the development of Ebola vaccines. And a mining community in Sierra Leone seeks justice in court as the trend gains currency across the continent.
There's more to this place than just glorious landscapes. There's more to it than just, say, Table Mountain or glorious, endless salt flats. There's more to it than countries that are home to some of the deepest mines in the world. There is so much more to this place, even if it is home to some of the finest diamonds on the planet. It is the sheer diversity of the people who call Southern Africa home and the relentless drive to make it a better place that make it so special. And we know that because this too is home. No one knows Southern Africa like we do. CGTN, see the difference.
British drug maker GlaxoSmithKline is stopping the development of 3 potential vaccines against the deadly Ebola and Marburg viruses. Now, Ebola is considered a rare and contagious disease, which renders the potential market for a sporadic vaccine unprofitable. GSK put the Ebola vaccine on hold following its inability to progress the product to the final stage due to the dwindling number of Ebola cases. Now, notably, U.S. drug companies like Merck and Johnson & Johnson are also developing potential vaccines against Ebola. However, they seem to have made more progress with them than GSK had in clinical trials. Well, in light of GSK's decision, let's head to one of the worst affected regions where Ebola has taken hundreds of lives. We're now joined by CGTN's Chris Ochamringa in Kinshasa. Chris, great to have you on the show. Now, though the DRC Ministry of Health had agreed that the country would stick to just one vaccine, the Merck vaccine, of course, as we mentioned, how much have these vaccines really helped in stemming the spread of the Ebola virus in the DRC?
Well, both international and local health experts say that the Merck vaccine has been 97% effective, in preventing the spread of this virus. This is a vaccine that's administered to people who've come into contact with Ebola patients, healthcare workers, and contacts of those contacts. And so what happens is people who were given this vaccine early in the stage of, after they get infected, have a higher chance of surviving this deadly disease. And so many of the people across the DRC are vouching for this vaccine. And Johnson & Johnson also was tested in West Africa in 2014, and it's said to have very good results. And so people are very optimistic. The only problem is that there are many other challenges that have prevented them from, containing this outbreak over this year that it has killed about 1,800 people.
Well, before we get into those challenges, Chris, what could be the implications for the DRC and other affected nations if we see these drug companies stopping the creation of these vaccines?
Well, it will have a devastating impact on these economies of the DRC and many other African countries because, the healthcare system of many sub-Saharan African countries is underfunded. The populations are very high and the governments cannot afford to provide quality health care for people. And these vaccines like the Merck and Johnson & Johnson are very expensive. These are experimental vaccines that are being used, on what they call a compassionate ground. The World Health Organization, the Centers for Disease Control and other regulatory bodies across the world have allowed this vaccine to be used because there's a crisis. People are dying in very large numbers, and so they're hoping that it will stop, the the spread of the disease. But, you know, many African countries cannot afford, and so they rely heavily on the support of the international community, which funds, you know, these very expensive vaccines. And so if Merck and Johnson & Johnson were to stop like GSK, then it would, you know, really have a very bad impact on many of these countries, because this outbreak has been happening largely, you know, in African countries over the past decades.
Well, many thanks, Chris. We'll certainly continue to watch that story closely. Of course, that was Chris Okamringa. He was joining us there in Kinshasa. Now let's move on to Sierra Leone, where a lawsuit filed by a community is showcasing how local groups in developing nations are opting to use legal methods to address their grievances. Now, the lawsuit, which was filed in March in the West African country's High Court, claims about $288 million in damages for the degradation or destruction of land, as well as the loss of livelihoods. Here's CGTN's Daniela Pearson reporting.
Diamond mining in Sierra Leone accounts for 46% of the mining industry revenue. However, for some, mining of the mineral has come at an unforeseeable cost. Adi Kalia Bangura is among those affected by the blasting at Sierra Leone's largest diamond mine. His house is riddled with cracks in the walls and holes in its aluminium roof as a result of the rocks loosening through the years.
You see, behind there, it's all damaged. This place is all damaged.
For dwellers around the region, life has become unbearable. Water has been contaminated, and with no other alternative, they have opted to settle for less.
This water well, you know, fine for we.
We get sick living here. Before this company arrived, this area had fine water.
This company not been begin for operate, we get a fine water.
Bangura is part of the group of residents in Koidu who have filed a lawsuit against diamond mining firm Octare Limited and other related companies. The complaint filed in Sierra Leone's High Court in March claims $288 million in damages. The group alleges Octare poisoned the water, destroyed houses, and failed to relocate hundreds of households away from the blast area. But the firm terms the lawsuit as an attempt to exploit the mine at the expense of national development. The company claims it has not used harmful chemicals in any of the blasting processes in Koidu mine. The lawsuits against foreign extracting companies have nearly doubled over the last decade. Daniela Pearson, CGTN.
You're watching Global Business Africa. Let's take a quick break now. Still to come. The People's Bank of China says movement of the yuan does not meet the criteria of currency manipulation. And Japan successfully tests its flying car.
Data out of the country. The country's foreign currency reserves.
With a dedicated and diverse team of anchors, CGTN now brings Africa to the palm of your hand.
I'm Penina Karibe in the heart of Nairobi, which is bustling.
From everyday heroes to the continent's most powerful figures, we bring their voices to you.
We haven't changed. And this is something most of us are very excited about.
We bring you news that's changing perspectives.
I'm Uche Okoronkwo reporting from Nairobi's city center.
News that brings Africa to the world. CGTN. See the difference. How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what do you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are these stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
past the hour, let's recap today's top headlines. Armed groups of the rival Fulani and Dogon ethnic communities in central Mali have now signed an accord to cease hostilities. Now, since 2015, a jihadist group recruiting mainly from the Fulani people has a clash with the ethnic Dogon and also Bambara communities, who in turn have created self-defense militias. Now, despite military help from France and the United Nations, Mali's government has struggled to calm the violence, which began in 2012. Meanwhile, Mozambique's ex-rebel group turned opposition party, Renamo, has signed a final peace agreement with the government in Maputo. The latest deal marks the third attempt to secure a lasting peace deal between the two longtime rivals since 1992. Now, this comes days after President Filipe Nyusi and Renamo leader Osufo Momade penned a pact agreeing to formally end military hostilities. And former South Sudan child soldiers are preparing to go back home after 3 months of negotiations by the United Nations agencies, armed groups and other partners. The 32 boys were recently released from the ranks of the Sudan People's Liberation Army in opposition. Last year, President Salva Kiir signed a peace agreement with rebel factions to end a civil war that has killed at least 50,000 people and displaced 2 million in the country. And lastly, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization has now warned of climate-related shocks that continue to drive high levels of severe food insecurity in Africa. Now, FAO is now scaling up its response to prevent an already alarming humanitarian situation from getting even worse. And that's a recap of today's top headlines. Well, let's now turn to the Chinese exchange rate. The yuan steadied on Tuesday, and that's after slumping through the symbolic 7 per dollar level on Monday. However, market sentiments remain fragile as a steep sell-off in the global market spurs fears over the escalating US-China trade war. Now, China's offshore yuan closed the trading session at about 7.07 per dollar as the onshore Chinese yuan fell to an 11-year low, brushing at around 7.03 per dollar. Meanwhile, the People's Bank of China says it will issue a 30 billion yuan bill, that's about $4.3 billion, in Hong Kong next Wednesday. The latest move is seen as a short selling of the currency, which is set to hold it back from devaluing further. And staying in China, earlier CGTN caught up with the deputy governor of China's central bank to discuss the ongoing trade friction between the world's biggest economies. Now, on Monday, the US labeled China a currency manipulator, a statement that is further escalating the trade war between the two powerhouses.
China vowed over and over to keep its currency steady, and we did so during both the 1997 Asian financial crisis and the 2008 recession, helping stabilize global financial markets and recover the world economy. In fact, the effective exchange rate of the renminbi, real or nominal, has increased about 40% since 2005, when the government started to act on the exchange rate reforms. That's also why China's international payment surplus now takes a much smaller share of its GDP, falling from 9.2% to 0.4% in 14 years.
Chen said that the renminbi depreciation since early August has been driven by pure market dynamics, which was changing along with global economic status and trade frictions. China, as a responsible country in the world, hasn't been and never will depreciate its currency to gain benefit in trade.
U.S. trade policies since 2018 have repeatedly shaken not only global financial markets, but also its domestic markets and the dollar index. So we truly hope that the U.S. could put a brake on that kind of moves. We also hope that the U.S. could respect the facts and try to resolve the trade issues with China in a more rational and practical manner.
The PBOC said in an earlier statement that labeling China as a currency manipulator will obstruct international trade, cut into the recovery of the world economy, and ultimately hurt the self-interest of the U.S. The unilateral act will also have serious impacts on the stable functioning of the international monetary system.
Now, what exactly are these standards that the American Treasury Department has to look at before labeling a country as a currency manipulator? Here's our next report finding out.
The U.S. Treasury Department has 3 criteria a country must meet to be called a currency manipulator. First, a country's trade surplus with the U.S. needs to exceed $20 billion US. This means the country exports much more to the U.S. than it imports. Second, the country's current account surplus exceeds 3% of its GDP. A current account surplus means a country is effectively lending money to the rest of the world, which has an impact on currency values. Third is if the country's net purchases of foreign currencies over the past 12 months is more than 2% of its GDP. In other words, the country is buying more foreign currencies than it's selling. China was on the U.S. Treasury Department's currency manipulation watch list in its May 2019 report solely for its trade surplus. The report said the surplus for the year under review totaled $390 billion. Timothy Ulrich, CGTN.
Now, of course, U.S. stocks also plunged to their worst loss in 2019 as investors scramble to sell off due to concerns of the ongoing trade war with China. Now, earlier, the Chinese yuan dropped to its lowest level against the dollar in more than a decade, and some Chinese companies halted purchases of U.S. farm products. The move follows President Trump's threat of additional tariffs on about $300 billion worth of Chinese goods, which will extend tariffs across almost all Chinese imports. The escalating dispute between the world's largest economies has rattled investors who are unnerved about a global economy that was already slowing and falling U.S. corporate profits. And shifting focus just slightly, China's ride-hailing giant Didi Chuxing has launched a program called 99 Cards, which offers financial services for drivers in Brazil. Now, Didi is hoping the move will boost its market share in a competitive ride-sharing sector in Brazil. Millions of people in the country do not have access to a bank account, and CGTN's Paula Cabral tells us more.
A couple of years ago, José Fernando da Silva lost his job and wanted to become a driver for a ride-sharing company. But he didn't have a bank account to receive his earnings. He wasn't alone. Tens of millions in Brazil don't use formal banking, and it was exactly this reality that prompted Chinese firm Didi Chuxing to launch a payment card for drivers, to get people like José to join their local app, 99. Passenger fares are paid directly to the driver's card within 1 hour of a trip, and the money can be used immediately to make purchases or pay bills.
I decided not to open an account because there are many bank fees to be paid besides the fee to the app itself. In the end, I would end up getting less money for my work.
Offering financial services for drivers was a move by Chinese company Didi Chuxing, aiming to gain market share in a competitive ride-sharing sector in Brazil, where millions of people have no access to bank accounts. Didi's 99 and Uber are the two key players in Brazil, also served by some other smaller companies. Both claim about 600,000 drivers, but Uber reports 22 million customers, while Didi's 99 says it has 18 million.
The competitor is very strong, to be honest. They are a very respectable player in this industry. But we truly believe we can offer a better solution and we can win in the long run, right? For example, if we think about one example of local innovation is the 99 card we are doing.
How was the 99 card received by the drivers? Did it work in your strategy?
We know that our drivers, they need a really fast cash flow to pay their gas to work, to make groceries, and pay their bills. And when we look at our competitors' offering, right, they are offer a 7 days transfer. When we do surveys asking them, what is the true differential of Didi's offering? 99 card is always mentioned as one of the key innovation differences.
Didi's partner in the 99 card says working with people outside the banking system opens a large market in developing countries like Brazil.
This partnership between Didi and MasterCard is innovative because it allows for the financial inclusion of millions of people who do not have access to the banking system. In Brazil, there are 60 million people who do not have bank accounts.
Brazil is the world's largest market for DD outside China, and the company claims to have ambitious plans and innovative ideas to further strengthen its position in this key Latin American economy. Paulo Cabral, CGTN, São Paulo.
Now, Chinese tech giant Huawei is going beyond smartphones when it comes to their 5G technology. The company has partnered with transportation authorities and hospitals across China, aiming to expand the application and usage of the next era of networks and communication. CGTN's Omar Khan brings us more on the diverse ways 5G is making an impact.
5G is often geared and marketed to consumers as the next generation technology for our smartphones. But for Huawei, their push into the 5G era is going beyond mobile devices. The tech giant has partnered with various companies around China, including transport authorities in the southwestern Chinese city of Chengdu. Here, the city's second ring road is fully covered by a 5G network.
We now see the first 5G bus series in China. It has two characteristics. First, it is 5G standalone network enabled. Second, it is the longest bus route in the country with 5G coverage, stretching for 28 kilometers. The bus is fitted with several major applications, including 5G powered 4K and 8K TVs. These buses can bring us a better experience.
The Chengdu bus line is the largest SA network in China, meaning it's specifically made for 5G transmission. On this demo bus, we're able to experience 5G speeds as we drive around the city. The application of 5G technology has also entered the medical field, helping both doctors and patients. When 5G is mentioned, people often think of how it's going to revolutionize our mobile phone experience. But here at the Third People's Hospital of Chengdu, doctors are using a 5G network to conduct long-distance consultations, highlighting how the technology can be applied to a variety of different cases. The remote consultation center allows doctors to perform ultrasonography tests from afar. Experts say the tests can be conducted with precision and that professional advice can be provided instantaneously.
5G technology features high bandwidth, low latency, and high transmission rate, enabling areas of telemedicine that were previously impossible to implement. For example, in the case of ultrasound tests, we can conduct real-time remote consultations in remote mountainous areas through real-time transmission across 5G networks.
Here at the Chengdu Hospital, doctors can control a mechanical arm all the way in Shenzhen. They believe the rewards greatly outweigh the potential risks.
If we're only using it as a remote consultation procedure, then there is no risk. Like remote ultrasound robot, when we set it up, it also sets a certain pressure. When the probe is pressed against the patient's body, its maximum pressure is controllable. This will ensure the safety of the patient.
In the near future, public transportation may allow people to become as productive as when they are in the office. And for the medical field, the ability to work remotely will further remove limits for the practice. All thanks to 5G. Omar Khan, CGTN, Chengdu.
Meanwhile, Japanese tech giant NEC has unveiled an electric flying car which hovered steadily for about a minute. Now, the early prototype, designed for autonomous delivery flights, looks more like a large drone than a typical car. It's about the size of an auto rickshaw, and it is equipped with 4 horizontal propellers. Now, the technology still has a few kinks to work out, like battery life as well as safety and regulations. Japan is at the moment eager to become a leader in the passenger drone industry. Its government has already built a test course for flying cars with the goal of having people zipping around in them by the 2030s. Well, on that note, let's shift our focus to commodities today. Oil prices rebounded slightly from big falls in recent sessions, but we did see Brent crude remain near seven-month lows at about $60 a barrel, and that's due to escalating trade tensions between China and the US. Meanwhile, gold prices steadying after touching a 6-year high as simmering tension between Washington and Beijing propels investors towards safe haven assets. Well, let's take a quick break now. Still to come. We look at the struggle to make a living amongst those displaced by militant group Boko Haram in Nigeria.
The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Panata, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
You don't find the stories of North Africa by sitting on the sidelines. No one else will take you where we can in North Africa. And no one else will show you what it's all about. CGTN, see the difference.
Now, in Nigeria, millions have been displaced by the decade-long insurgency in the country's northeast. Women and children suffer the most, often losing their husbands and fathers to Boko Haram attacks. Now, most of the displaced are now housed in camps across the country. Despite the odds, some are devising creative ways to earn a living. Here's CGTN's Deji Badmus with the story of one young survivor.
Since 2014, this camp in the outskirts of the Nigerian capital city of Abuja has been home to these displaced people from the town of Goza in the northeast Borno state. They were resettled here after Boko Haram insurgents invaded their communities. Many in the camp are women and children. Behind the smile on some of the faces here are stories of horror and torture from Boko Haram, but they are managing to forge ahead with life. Maimuna Ali came to this camp with her mother and siblings after Boko Haram overran their village and killed their father. With her education interrupted as a result of the incident, she has been making ends meet with her tailoring skills, which she learned from her mom since the age of 7.
It's all from this tailoring business that we feed and take care of ourselves if any of our family members fall sick. We're 9 in my family, including my mom. My dad was killed by Boko Haram at our village 5 years ago. So it's from this business that we take care of all our needs. In fact, I thank God and my mother who taught me how to sew. I don't like begging, and this has ensured we don't beg for what to feed on.
A number of younger girls in the camp are already learning the craft from Maimuna. They've signed up as apprentices. But then Maimuna has dreams bigger than the 4 walls of this camp. She hopes to get sponsorship to attend the fashion school to launch a career in designing.
I need assistance to buy more sewing machines. I also need a shop of my own so I can expand and grow the business to continue to assist my family and others. I also want to continue my education so that someday I can start my own fashion line.
Maimuna would probably not be sewing today if an NGO had not bought her the sewing machine she's currently using. A number of girls and women in the camp who also have the skills have not been so lucky to have their own sewing machines.
We have some women that they learn and they don't have access, they don't have money to start. And we have some women that they don't have the experience. They want to learn again because we come individually. We didn't come together. That is why some that they came first, they have learned. Some that they came second, they have learned. But some that they come the third time, they didn't learn anything. So they need to learn. And after learning, we need to give us the access, the empowerment, so that we continue doing it, so that we are not staying for looking for somebody to come and give us something.
Another problem the camp is battling with is the number of children of school age who are not in school. The camp women leader says the situation is getting worrisome.
Presently now, we have a 143 children that in ground, they are not going to school. They are just walking upside down. That is which is bad. We are a Nigerian. We're supposed to look after IDPs. Sometimes if they see us like now, me, I wear clothes, I eat, they will think that IDP, they don't have problem. It's liar. We have problem. We have something that are eating us inside.
At many camps like this across Africa, there are too many people and too few resources to go around. But rather than wait on the government, some, like Memuna, are taking their destinies in their own hands and doing all they can to leave the camp and go back to their normal lives. Deji Badmos, CGTN, Abuja, Nigeria.
Well, still in Nigeria, the Nupe people in the country's middle belt are known for their breathtaking brass works. It's an age-long craft that has earned them both national and international recognition. But as CGTN's Kelechi Mekalam reports, there are rising concerns that their craft may be going extinct.
The rhythmic clanging sounds of brass by craftsmen in the ancient kingdom of Nupe, a people known and admired for their works of art for several centuries. They've maintained the same old traditional style of processing the metal, with a locally made furnace and a wheel to fan it. It's more than a tradition passed down from generations.
This work is our heritage. If you are born here and you belong to this clan, then you must be able to do this work. If you are not born here, you will not be able to do it. Our children are passionate about this craft. We don't have to force them to do it. Once a child is 10 years old, he will know where to go to pick up the working tools.
Their works have drawn enthusiasts of arts and crafts from around the world. From spears and swords for war in the pre-colonial era, they've evolved into producing various products, including cooking pots, kitchen utensils, artifacts, and flower pots. But masters of the art are worried that brass making is gradually going into extinction.
This is due to a lack of raw materials. Before now, this place was always packed with finished brasswork, but now, as you can see, we just have a few because of a lack of raw materials. We would like the government to intervene in funding so that we may continue producing more. Previously, they would order large quantities. For example, they would order 200 kettles, then we would produce them. But the government now does not patronize us again.
Arts and crafts are Nigeria's foremost traditional occupations and have continued to serve as veritable tools for economic empowerment. However, not much attention is paid to them. Despite the constraints, the people of Nupe Kingdom are determined to keep their traditional crafts alive. They're exploring the use of metals including aluminium, silver, and copper. Kelechi Mekalam, CGTN Abuja, Nigeria.
Now here in Kenya, celebrated artist John Dianga has played a crucial role in establishing visual arts in Kenya. Now Dianga's towering forms can be seen at his center in Pangulu Pangala in Kisumu. Now in his 70s, he has showcased his pieces in both Africa and abroad. He's calling on younger artists in the country to invest in developing their talent, and he urges African governments to establish art hubs to celebrate the continent's rich culture.
It's like they are holding the globe.
His is a legacy that spans more than 5 decades. John Dianga is a silent legend who explores his expression in various art forms, from painting to sculpting, both large and small pieces, to performing visual arts on TV and on stage.
Around 71, I started now exhibiting outside, Nairobi and other places. So the journey started in 68 of exposure.
Like an art piece tells a story, John Dianga has evolved in his use of various media, wood, clay, soapstone, and now cement to bring forth the message.
Cement will stay forever if you use it. Unlike clay. And cement is the most common material you can now use permanently for sculptural activities.
Statements of history and social cultural issues are erected in his delicately balanced ecosystem of art and nature.
She is capturing what's happening in this society today, and I did it particularly to help caution our students around Maseno and students in the environment about early pregnancies.
And on the very delicate issue of gender equality, Dyanga captured the existing struggle in a towering, insurmountable, almost 12-foot form, naturally prompting a short discussion on the never-ending topic.
Pride emanates from the kind of pampering. We have given them a lot of support in terms of materials and in terms of money, to the extent that they live more comfortably than the boy child. And he's saying, please accept me back. And this girl looks down and says, Kazibure, you're wasting your time. If you look at her face, she's facing away from the young man. The young man is drunk, and this is what is happening to our society today.
He also celebrates a time past in African food culture.
This is a grinding stone, as it is, and you would put your millet or muogo. Maize was not easy because you would have first to crack it down and then you grind it.
Dyanga looks back and celebrates his legacy with the hope to inspire the future generation.
Like now, I'm turning 74 next month. I'm still marching on. My target, serious target, is students, the upcoming children. They visit here, and when they come here, they live here fired. We need more of this kind of thing all over so that they can see what they can do with themselves. They can see what they can handle with their hands creatively. It will help.
He has created a universe documenting Kenya and Africa's journey through art in the hopes that this will remind the world of stories that were and should not be forgotten. Beryl Oro, CGTN, Kisumu, Kenya.
Well, before we go, let's take a quick look at how Africa's currencies performed today. We saw South Africa's rand firmer against the dollar today. It actually was the second best performing emerging market currency, as of course calm returned to the markets after China dialed back its currency weakness, easing trade war jitters. Meanwhile, Nigeria's naira was quoted at 363.54 per dollar today, weaker than the 362.80 which it was quoted at a week ago. Now, traders say foreign investors are exiting local bonds there and businesses are repatriating their dividends. Well, that's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. Remember, you can send your feedback to the contacts on your screen. You can also follow us on our various digital media platforms. From me, Uche Okoronkwo, and the rest of the team, thanks for watching.